Godzilla, the king of the kaiju. For almost 70 years, he stood at the pinnacle of what it means to be a monster. An unstoppable force of nature that destroys indiscriminately. One without bias or judgment, never meant to be fully a villain, nor a hero, just a pure representation of the absolute carnage and unbridled power that man unknowingly released upon itself in the atomic era. But we know you aren't here to talk about meta-narrative or the greater consequences of mankind creating its own doomsday. You want to see giant dinosaurs make buildings go boom. And I can't blame you. With the trailer for Godzilla Vs Kong New Empire, the release of Monarch Legacy of Monsters, and the obscenely successful Godzilla -1, it seems you can't go anywhere anymore without hearing about the classic Goji King. And while you might be asking yourself, Tuck, why are you doing a video about Godzilla? He's not an anime character. To that, I just have to say, look, I really like dinosaurs, alright? So consider yourself lucky that this video didn't just evolve into Jurassic Park Power Scaled or something. Instead, you get to join me on indulging in a piece of that sweet Godzilla action, and trust me, you're in for a ride. Because we aren't just covering one or two, not even a few, but we're touching on every single major film iteration of the walking manifestation of war, so that by the time we're done with this, you should have a pretty good idea of not just who's on the insanely long list of overpowered characters he can and has canonically defeated in the past, but you'll also know a definitive answer to just how strong is Godzilla actually. To start this video off, I think, considering his immense popularity and aforementioned success at the box office, before we can dive to the bottom of this kung fu fighting Godzilla iceberg, we should probably look at what I'd call the most realistic version of the character to date. -1 Godzilla. Light spoilers ahead for the film, obviously, but when I personally think about Godzilla and the many iconic abilities he possesses, this absolute unit has all the bare essentials, from his atomic breath to his semi-aquatic lizardy looks, while dropping the more wacky, out-there stuff that your average tea-sipping, coffee-drinking 9-to-5 adult would find, as the kids put it, weird. He clocks in at an astonishing 50.1 meters, or a little over 164 feet for you less precociously inclined individuals, and with his origin story as a dinosaur thing that literally got atom blasted out of existence as a result of humanity's hubris, is about as simple and classic as a Godzilla backstory can be. Considering his standing in the movie and the fact that, once again, this is a more realistic interpretation of the character, he serves as a good baseline for anyone later on down the list. However, just because he's not so outlandish doesn't mean at all that he's not just as destructive and menacing as ever. As we see in the film, while he's obviously as impervious to typical human weapons as he's always been, flinging 16,000-ton battleships around like Lego pieces or keeping pace with 400-mile-per-hour planes in straight combat, the real oomph in his toolkit comes from the nuclear powers he's so commonly shown to wield across his appearances, as when threatened or serious, Godzilla can charge up a massive burst of atomic radiation from his cells, giving his eyes, mouth, and spines a vibrant blue color for all of a few moments before devastation is unleashed in the form of a violently hot radioactive beam, which is so destructive in this particular iteration that even the king himself is shown to be burned and weakened from the usage of this particular attack. But considering it was able to wipe out over 20,000 buildings, 30,000 civilians, and pulverize a 6-kilometer wide crater from just the indirect airburst in the novelization, since we basically know the exact area and dimensions that were affected, the math should easily put even the most casual estimates for this version of the atomic breath at over a megaton of TNT, which for some perspective would be like the blast that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki going off over 50 times all at once. And unlike other mildly more wholesome versions of the character, this interpretation also seems to leave the scars of atomic warfare as well, from the potential radiation poisoning we see at the end of the film. Yet, as you might guess, we're still right up here at the tip of the iceberg because as much as people love this movie and its version of the Big G, this is a very green Godzilla by comparison to many others. Considering he's never been pushed in an on-screen confrontation, having never interacted with any other weapons or titans that were really capable of doing any lasting damage. To the point that some people would argue that this particular Godzilla's best feat is before he even became Godzilla, since as just a regular old dinosaur thing, he survives the blast from Operation Crossroads, which was a nuclear weapons test, or as you might better know it, that time when America decided to nuke Bikini Atoll and create He Who Lives in a Pineapple Under the Sea. But in this continuity, regular Lizardzilla was there and managed to tank said blast with a combination of raw durability as well as a form of regeneration that works faster than the eye can see. It's sort of the last common power shared among all Godzillas, but with this one in particular, he's just surprisingly resilient and good at using it. And now, as a fully fledged, completely mutated version of the strongest kaiju, if ever really pushed to show his upper limits, he could unironically survive most, if not everything that humanity is currently equipped to throw at him from the feats we've seen. But, now that we've acquainted you with what could be considered the Godzilla only Pepperidge Farm remembers, let's crank the ludicrous dial from like a 4 to an easy 7. Jumping back over half a decade to 2016, whew, boy, that makes a guy feel old, but once we arrive back in 2016 though, we are introduced to Shin Godzilla, who is basically what would happen if you took -1 and sprinkled some light sci-fi seasoning on top. I mean, for comparison, this is -1's breath, and this is the monstrosity of a demon disco ball that is Shin's. Standing at a ludicrous 118.5 meters, or over 388 feet, aside from being more than 2 -1s tall, he's got all your standard Godzilla abilities such as regeneration, atomic breath, and lizardy swimming, but with some new added rapid evolution quirks, as this Zilla wasn't even a dinosaur, but just some rando sea creature off the coast of Japan, when a nuclear waste disaster basically triggered it to become Godzilla. And just considering statements made about this ability, as well as the fact that this could literally have went from sea turtle to actual kaiju in practically 0 time, yeah, this version of Godzilla clearly had some seriously untapped potential, likely the most of any on this list, with his ability to rapidly progress, granting him a strange level of sentience and easily the weirdest physical form. Despite that though, even keeping in mind his cool sci-fi-esque abilities, and the fact that his death would have threatened the whole world with radioactive pollution, he's easily the weakest on the list, even in comparison to -1, considering a single atom bomb was stated strong enough to kill this Godzilla, whereas even like a random dinosaur, -1 was able to survive those same small nuclear tests. However, I will mention in a Japanese 4D ride experience thing, he managed to keep up an extended clash against an Ava unit, so if that's canon, maybe he got way stronger. But like I said though, these guys are the small fries. So if you really want to crank that ludicrosity up from a 7 to an 11, we're not just gonna need a sci-fi monster Godzilla, but we're gonna have to jump straight to the bottom of this iceberg, a solid 2 years prior to Shin, to find my personal favorite iteration of the Titan, Legendary Godzilla. This version of the character, at a very slightly less imposing 108 meters or 354 feet, is part of the MonsterVerse saga, which for me strikes the perfect balance between stupid fun monster flicks and we have to take our movies very seriously around here. He's practically the Mortal Kombat of Godzilla in that regard, since I mean, just look at that fatality. Yeah, you're not getting up from one of those. But then he turns around and does some goofy Johnny Cage stuff like this.
What in the actual...
So what does all that mean for this Godzilla's scaling? Well, I'll tell you what it means. He's an unstoppable god of hyperdeath. That's what it means. You thought I was exaggerating with an 11? Oh, no, no, no. In his tie-in prequel comic, you see this meteor that wiped out all the dinosaurs? Caused a country-sized explosion? Yeah, it smacked Godzilla straight in the face and he was fine. You see this? Yeah, it looks like a pretty normal, casual, good old atomic breath. We like those. Till you realize, oh wait, he just blasted a hole all the way to the center of the Earth. Do you think that is all? No! He literally fought Superman! Is it canon? Is this main DC continuity? I don't know. I don't care. He literally one-shot the Man of Steel right out of the sky with one blast. Needless to say, this version of the Escapist King is absurdly powerful, and unlike those before him on the list, he's battled other actual kaiju and superhumans during his tenure, and just considering how casually he's matched or eviscerated said enemies, he should easily be in that world-ending class of strength at a minimum of large country to possibly multi-continental and beyond power. With his feats against literal DC superstars and higher-end calcs clearly implying higher potential metas, especially for stronger forms. Also, just so you're in the loop, every Godzilla from here on should be able to react to lightspeed characters due to boxing with the likes of King Ghidorah or other relative kaiju who can react to his atomic breath, which is composed of radiation moving at vaguely around the speed of light. But from here on, when talking about general scaling and relativity to one another, while I'm very comfortable saying our current Godzilla scaling chain looks something like this, everything after this point becomes contentious due to how interconnected the lore is between many film versions of the characters. For example, a theater program for Godzilla Final War just blatantly states that this version of Kaiser Ghidorah is stronger than those who came before it, despite an obvious lack of feats or direct connection to the Showa or Heisei eras, or even things like said Final War Godzilla beating up another quote-unquote Godzilla of sorts from a separate film with a titular monster that is so underwhelming to most fans that we just call him Zilla. So to give you just some brief mentions of other powerful Godzillas who should also be equally around that 11 mark on the scale, we've got the Kiryu Saga Godzilla, because he fought Kiryu, who's my favorite kaiju design for anything, and said Kiryu could freeze over massive chunks of the ocean with his absolute zero cannon. This big G has also fought his fair share of titans, relatively speaking, with a pretty big collection of films. Then there's GMK Godzilla. If he was on the scale, he might be a little bit more like a 10 than a straight 11, but even so, he blew up King Ghidorah, which is a cool feat and impressive regardless in terms of greater Godzilla lore. Godzilla Millennium is up after that. He stopped a spaceship that was moving pretty fast. And then there's the Godzilla who did that but way cooler, Final Wars. Like I said before, he whooped up on Kaiser Ghidorah in pretty casual fashion, as well as like a lot of other kaiju all in one film, with mostly the use of straight hands. I mean, like, look at this, he's practically a 100-meter LeBron with hops like these, or a 328-foot Jordan if you're hip with the Imperial system. His best feat in the film is stopping this massive, casually planet-destroying meteor from literally no-diffing the Earth, which is a little more impressive than where we were at the start of this video, obviously. But Final War Godzilla does back up the straight nigh planetary power pretty consistently, due to them, well, literally just saying he could destroy the Earth in the movie if he wanted to, which is the maximum amount of ridiculousness our scale could feasibly handle for the giant dinosaur, cementing him right around or above the current capstone of legendary Godzilla. And again, while his relation to the other films is kinda questionable, what isn't questionable at all is the fact that the two oldest Godzillas are pretty much universally agreed upon as the baddest and beefiest. Heisei Godzilla and Showa Godzilla. While we could dance around the idea of these two, you know, also maybe being around planetary or fighting for that top spot with those other two top dogs, with their own planetary power and lightspeed stats or whatever, it would honestly be a waste of your time. These two are so stupidly broken that they'd blow up the ludicrosity scale and dance upon its ashes. With even the most casual fights they have against other kaiju like King Kong or classic Ghidorah being shown to cause almost planet-wide devastation without even really trying. Where almost every piece of supporting material classifying these top-tier kaiju as greater cosmic threats, such as Ghidorah being the strongest in space, quote-unquote, compared to the likes of supernovas and planet-busting bombs. Or even Mechagodzilla, one of the Goji's biggest rivals, surviving the effects of a literal black hole. With all of this literally just being the tip of the iceberg in comparison to what Showa Godzilla has shown us, who has fought literal 4D beings. And I mean, if you say they're the same Godzilla, he has even canonically soloed the Marvel Earth, off-screening a classic Hulk, overpowering a classic Thor, and just casually beating down the Avengers Fantastic Four duo to the point where they basically just had to ask him to leave in a completely canon comic book, while also just kind of ignoring his many other crossovers, insane experience, and odd assortment of random niche abilities. Of course, you can't forget to mention that he's doing all that while being the shortest Godzilla at 50 meters even, as well as doing literal dinosaur kung fu through it all. I can't make this stuff up. With that sort of absurdity only seemingly really being rivaled by the likes of Heisei, who asked, "How can I be stronger than a guy who soloed the Avengers?" Ah, I know, I'll fight him, but in space. Yeah, Heisei Godzilla could square off with a stated to be potentially infinite Space Godzilla, which is unironically kind of backed up by the fact that even just one of Heisei Godzilla's cells, just a single one, was able to survive a black hole interfused with the effects of multiple supernovas all at once. Yes, just roll with it. These two giant lizards are potentially threatening all of reality if you use their most charitable ends, without even ever addressing the idea of how other kaiju from between continuities might scale to each other, such as Kaiser Ghidorah and Heisei Ghidorah, perhaps even outscaling the casually planetary, supernova tanking OG Ghidorah if you take those outside sources, promotional material, and statements very literally. Even then, all the versions of Godzilla I mentioned in the video so far are still nowhere close to every single version of Godzilla that has ever been made, with many an adaptation being glossed over for this particular video, such as Godzilla Earth, who might literally just be the strongest of them all. But in terms of movie Godzillas, and honestly just film characters in general, the Showa era and Heisei era kings are two completely opposite but equally overpowered versions of the character who can just likely solo the majority of fiction, with easy planetary, star, and even a hypothetical universal scale, with the doors being wide open by the sheer wackiness of comic book outliers, for them to potentially scale to ragdolling all the Avengers if you genuinely believe the statements made about Godzilla during the Marvel crossover all apply to the Marvel Earth's maximum strength feats. It might literally make this version of Marvel comic Showa Godzilla some outerversal threat beyond almost all of fiction, but the same thing maybe even unironically being true for legendary Godzilla as well if that crossover with DC ends up being anything close to canon. So as for my conclusion about Godzilla, his weakest iterations are casually in those atomic to town level ranges with subsonic and beyond speeds, but his more consistent ranges during the majority of his films have placed him around the multi-continental to planetary range, with either lightning or light speed atomic breath to scale speed with. And I mean, if you look back at certain statements with just some minor rose-tinted glasses, hype up some fan-calced feats, or use specific versions of the character, then you can easily get the likes of Showa and Heisei or even others via scaling to them all the way up into the star and solar system ranges with those consistent black hole feats across a shocking number of his films, as well as that awkward universal and beyond dimensional scaling meta for anyone who just wants to go down that rabbit hole. But I'll leave the validity of those insane comic book soloing versions of the characters up to the discretions of you guys. If the idea of bringing the King of Monsters back for a full fight on the channel sounds interesting to you guys though, let me know down below. And be sure to subscribe before you go, since we are unreasonably close to hitting that 1K goal we placed for the month of Almighty. It would really mean a lot to reach that before the end of December, but regardless, I hope you all enjoyed, and that's all for today. Thanks, everyone.